the system of identity today is a system of infinite replication. I go to the government, they say who I am, they give me a card that says who I am, and then I go to anywhere, and I want to open an account with you, and they take a look at my ID and they make a copy on their database, right? And you just have to trust that everyone's got good policies, and that there's billions of consulting revenue to try to tick boxes and protect people's system in this system of infinite sharing or infinite replication. And now we see a push in Canada around open banking. Open banking is really the concept as it's being built and rolled out is making the system of infinite replication easier.
You're listening to One Feather, Two Pens. Lessons and stories from Indigenous peoples building and navigating digital sovereignty. A special series on What's That Noise?
Matthew always took a few minutes at the very beginning just to get things opened up in a good way and get us started on our conversation by acknowledging that we are gathering on traditional territories of Indigenous people across what we now call Canada. We recognize that the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples are the original stewards of these lands and waters, with very distinct languages and histories and ways of knowing that continue to shape not only our lives today, but I think of everyone in Canada. And I do want to take an extra special moment in this session, just I think to extend that, also and acknowledge that we honor the Métis Nations as Indigenous peoples with their own unique culture. Born from a meeting of First Nations and European peoples, particularly in the Red River, but all across the prairies and waterways of this continent. And so we acknowledge that the Métis were voyagers and bridge builders and people who have maintained a very distinct identity, governance systems, and a connection to the land despite centuries of displacement and marginalization. And we recognize that Indigenous sovereignty has never been ceded, and that the work of reconciliation continues today and requires ongoing commitment to supporting all of our Indigenous brothers and sisters in self-determination, and in particular in digital spaces. We'll talk a little bit about that today. And as we discuss technology and innovation, we carry this responsibility, I believe, to ensure that those conversations honor Indigenous knowledge systems and contribute to an Indigenous-led future. And finally, I just want to acknowledge that it's a privilege to be able to share these stories and these perspectives and visit with our guests and to convey that we continue to commit using this platform to amplify Indigenous voices and the experiences across Turtle Island. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here and very excited to be part of this. So I come from the Red River Valley. I grew up in the Red River Valley, southeastern Manitoba, as a lot of people know it. My family stems from Plains Cree, and we're part of the Métis Nation here in Canada. I am I guess technologist is a broad term. Founded a company called iComply seven and something years ago, and we specialize in basically providing trust and security, privacy for online interactions, specializing in financial services. But that has now stemmed, obviously, to more things like trust on the internet, networks of trust, digital identity, things all along those lines. And I'm also on the board of the British Columbia Technology Association, BC Tech. And I'm fairly active in a couple of the Indigenous technology circles or communities, really looking to, first it started as a journey to see if there was anyone else in tech who from an Indigenous way of life or community, and then it's now turned to more seeing that there's so many of us actually here, and we just it's really coming out of the woodwork, and so trying to facilitate more and more of that, creating examples for the next generation to see them, see technology as something that's viable for them, no matter where they grew up or what they came from or what their family life heritage, whatever circumstances are. There really are not limiting factors. If we can help to bridge that gap, we can definitely bridge these types of factors that have limited so many people from accomplishing their potential or pursuing their dreams.
Matt, anyone who has an opportunity to look up your bio on LinkedIn or check out your profile page online can see that you are a successful Métis business person who has built an amazing company. I'd like to get a sense from you. I'd like to understand your personal journey, if you like, a little bit, and whatever cultural, social, family foundations you applied on your path from your wealth management history to your blockchain innovation to iComply now. It's all fascinating. I think that's an amazing journey. And I'd like to get a little bit deeper into that personal story and how your Métis identity and values shaped your understanding of how to build, develop, and lead in this space. And maybe there aren't, but are there Indigenous ways of knowing about trust and relationships? How these things could fundamentally be reimagined and how we approach digital compliance and identity, not just technical solutions, but an expression of who we are as Indigenous people. There's a lot there, but I hope you get the gist of what I'm asking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe to start, a bit in my personal journey. I grew up. I kind of call myself like a scoop ripple effect baby. My mother chose when she was young and pregnant that maybe it would be best to hide all of the Indigenous side of my identity. And so I think was largely due to the fact that probably every Indigenous kid that she knew was scooped up into residential school. Right. That really influenced a lot of my, growing up. I was adopted into a very white community, a Mennonite community, lovely people, learned so much values and taking care of each other, etc. Grew up with the understanding of even things like a lot of subtext that might be racist, even if the intent was in no way malicious, around, who Indigenous people were, who Métis people were, etc. And yet at the same time, I always questioned why I got a better tan every summer than everyone else. And as an adult, I met my family, my biological father and family, and really got an opportunity to connect. And one was really welcomed into that, and also had an opportunity to really start to make up for some lost time around connecting with heritage and cultural aspects that I didn't have. We had in my high school, or just growing up, I think compared to a lot of Canadians and especially North Americans, we had very good Indigenous education, but it's another thing to hear about somebody's story versus know that it's your own story and it's part of your own history. And so, today that's now, as I learn and go and take part in rituals or events or celebrations, I also bring my son and really want to reconnect those links, and so, I grew up on a farm. Thought I would never want to work in an office job, which actually I don't, because it's remote work nowadays. But always thought it would be welding or mechanics or farming or something like this, and had the opportunity in school to start seeing that, hey, I'm actually really good at some other stuff here, and how can I use that? So I started my journey career-wise working in financial services, built a very rapidly growing practice here in Canada, and actually sold that to several of the Investors Group company, kind of sold different pieces into there, and worked at their head office for a couple of years, trying to drive innovation, and basically supporting technology and product rollouts for about 5,000 advisors across the country. If you're leading any sort of innovation in a large FI, it can be an uphill battle. And after a while, I felt like I wanted to be on the tech side of tech and finance, and moved to Vancouver. And that's about 14 years ago now. And, got onto did a number of different technology management consulting projects over the years. And, there was one project specifically that I worked on at Investors Group where I watched advisors take clients saying, hey, I want to buy RBC stock. And the advisor didn't have a license to that. So they call a broker on a trading floor, and the broker keys that into a transaction. And that goes to a dot matrix printer that somebody tears off a page and manually types that into, 5 to 20 different systems. And I was, why don't we do an API? Oh, we can't for all of these reasons, And I met the founder of the Ethereum blockchain 2013, 2014. And when I heard about the idea of smart contracts as a logic layer over top of a blockchain's immutable database, I finally was able to connect the dots of how this could impact the world that I knew. And long story short, we started iComply. And it's been one heck of a journey since then. As far as cultural values, our driving force as a company has our mission statement is trust in every transaction. And, we're a for-profit enterprise, profit, revenue, those are all important things. But we've really played the long game as far as doing things properly. We do facial recognition, but we don't use APIs because we felt that taking possession of PII and leaking that data was maybe not the future that even I want my son to grow up in. I've had my identity stolen, and many other people. We get scam calls, every day from leaked telco data. And there's just so many things broken in the old way of the internet. The infrastructure of the original internet was built for information sharing. It wasn't built for value transfer, and it wasn't really built for what we have today. So we really do need better layers of trust and security and privacy. And that's really what we're setting out to build, not just, for myself in my lifetime, but just the infrastructure that allows new things to be built on top of, and kind of a new social contract with things like even your own personal identity data, as an example.
Matthew, it's so interesting hearing about your story and your emphasis on connecting with your identity and your past. I'm not sure if you guys heard about Lawrence Douglas Corbière, the elder from Manitoba. Did this come across your headlines at all?
This morning, there's a Corbière has a long history. That name has a long history in this country, particularly around Indigenous rights, and it does, yeah. Interesting.
WestJet rejected his identity card and prevented him from boarding a flight. The expiry, which is a very, very contentious and important topic to talk about at all times, I think. The expiration date is 4 years out, something like that, something ridiculous. And the WestJet agent couldn't see the expiry date. In fact, not only did they accuse him of being dishonest about who he was, they thought he was from East India.
Oh, geez.
And not from Canada. And so when I'm listening to you talk, I'm hearing you talk about the ability to find yourself, connect with your historical identity, and build tools for a digital future. And we're caught in this predicament where there are so many institutions and powers in this country that tell stories about Indigenous identity without that person being able to speak. And I know what I'm sharing is a bit provocative, but I'm just really genuinely curious about what comes to mind. Is there something about Indigenous digital design that can circumvent these kinds of problems from happening in the future? Is this really a social and cultural issue? And I know I'm emphasizing problems before solutions a lot here, but I would be remiss not to share this gentleman's story with you, especially because you're an expert on digital identity.
A lot of things come up for me in this story. The stories that people tell about us. I saw a different story. Maybe I'll leave the exact specifics out. But there was an article that I saw this week about an Indigenous individual that had a standoff with the police. And oddly, it's not news. It happened quite some time ago, and all of a sudden, it's hitting all the news waves. First question is, why now?
Yeah,
Second question. 100% of the data and the photos and everything around the story came from one side and of the equation. Nobody seemed to contact the other party to see what maybe brought things to this point. And the system of identity today is a system of infinite replication. And what I mean by that is I go to the government, they say who I am, they give me a card that says who I am, and then I go to anywhere, and I want to open an account with you, and they take a look at my ID and they make a copy on their database, right? And you just have to trust that everyone's got good policies, and that there's billions of consulting revenue to try to tick boxes and protect people's system in this system of infinite sharing or infinite replication. And now we see a push in Canada around open banking. Open banking is really the concept as it's being built and rolled out is making the system of infinite replication easier. The sharing and replication of your data easier, but it's not actually solving the problem that you still have to rely on the fact that, hey, I gave you all my sensitive information and I hope you don't have any employees that go rogue, and I hope you don't have any leaks or breaches or get phishing attacks or anything else. Digital identity, by my definition, is a system where there's one source of truth. And that individual has sovereignty and control over who has access to, they can provide fully informed consent. Yes, you can access my name and my photo. Well, let's say it was during COVID. All of a sudden you're walking into any place of business and they want to look at your ID card, and then they want to know your medical history, which is just, a little bit bonkers for a privacy nerd. But what all they needed to know was whether or not, for the rules at the time, was whether or not you were vaccinated. That was one question. They didn't need to know your address, your date of birth. Any of these other things weren't relevant, right? And so if we get to a point where where we're actually using the technology that's available for digital identity, we can create, we have the infrastructure available. It needs to be implemented and adopted to enable a world where the individual has control over their privacy, over their security, and that that the power that returns back to the individual in the marketplace. As far as a consumer goes, you're no longer the product of your personal data for this free app. The whole tech world would have to kind of revamp so much of their value propositions.
There's a bit of it's really a paradox, right? I mean, from an Indigenous, maybe just from an individual perspective, but certainly from an Indigenous perspective, this sense of sovereignty versus decentralization, right? And the technology that's used to build systems particularly around digital identity. So there's this tension in my mind. There's like this huge tension there, right? And Matthew, you've highlighted some of that. I think not only from the technology itself, but just in how the technology is used and really the social or cultural protocol that's required. So even if the box says yes, I'm vaccinated, I can come in, I need to see something else to validate that's actually legit. Do you think? And even more so, all these systems exist inside these capitalist frameworks, and I'm not banging on profit or nonprofit. We're a for-profit. One Feather is a for-profit entity. We couldn't do what we do if we were a nonprofit. We'd be 10 years behind where we are today. So there's a real advantages there. But I guess in terms of that context of that paradox, do these systems, or can these systems, Matthew, I want your sense of, can these systems actually serve Indigenous sovereignty, and what does that look like? What does that look like in an end result that isn't just colonialism wrapped up in different packaging?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe it is there's so many threads there. I think one aspect here is when you Web 2, as some people call it, the idea is centralization, right? There's single point of control of a website, of a database, of what have you. In decentralized architecture, it's not necessarily that every stakeholder has the same level of rights and access. And so you have a much more flexibility. I think the nature of centralization as humans, as somebody who's been in technology management and innovation for 2 decades now, we tend to see that when somebody digitizes something, they just digitize the paper process. They don't look at what does the technology enable, right?
Yeah.
And so, if you rewind the clock 600 years, there's very few educated people. Control needed to be, just for the sake of growing civilizations, the centralization was a needed function. When you have information sharing like the internet enabled, when you have what certain types of blockchain technologies enable, you're creating infrastructure that allows you to have that same level of security within an ecosystem without necessarily centralizing control. And even when you do centralize, because there's always going to be points of centralization, some admin person is going to be, tasked and employed with checking boxes or something.
Yeah.
But decentralized systems have this unique feature that allows you can hire somebody, put them in that role, give them that control, and everything they do is documented and transparent.
Yeah.
So if they go rogue and go off the rails, you have that. And so the level of transparency that it enables is very fascinating. I think within the context of the landscape within Canada and the Indigenous, the nations within Canada and the communities, there's an opportunity to use these technologies to leapfrog the infrastructure that the government of Canada has today. And I'll give you, one example. If you think around the idea of, you could roll out a central bank digital currency, and it could be a tool for surveillance. It could be a tool for control. If you donate to a political campaign that the government doesn't really like, they can freeze your money, just like they can freeze your bank accounts. If you architect that exact same digital currency, just slightly different, you create a whole different ecosystem. So the devil's in the details, I think, with a lot of this. And it's important to, from my perspective, there's, in the blockchain space, there's a lot of tribalism, like ideology around, this is the best thing ever, so no other database could be better than this database. We need to remember that if innovation is working, it's always innovating. We're always, it's never going to be perfect. And if it is today, it won't be perfect tomorrow. And if we can come at this and we can focus on, how do we bring people together to have consensus and share ideas about how we want this infrastructure to be used, I think that's where we have something incredibly powerful.
Normally, my role in this podcast is one that sort of sits in the background, and I listen and I try to provoke and bring us into new directions. And sometimes that's philosophical. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm going to do something quite different, because I imagine there's a lot of people listening right now that are curious and fascinated to hear you two gentlemen talk about centralization versus decentralization. And I bet you there's more than a few that don't really know the difference. Could we just spend a minute and maybe talk about what that means, maybe in two senses? First, in the context of digital identity and technology, but also in terms of Indigenous value, because I think there's something really fascinating here about the concept of diffusing power away from a central locus. And I'll leave it at that, because I know you have a lot to say, Matthew.
The aspect of centralization, I think I have a good analogy here, but when you're giving somebody control, and maybe we can trim some of this out, but I'll use actually a perfect example of, I actually wrote an article, probably 6-7 years ago now, talking about why blockchain was, and decentralized technologies like blockchain would unlock and make things like cooperatives much more capable than they were today, because their ability to scale the act of consensus. Consensus building is a very challenging thing to do in any infrastructure, but in centralization, let's look at government today. You appoint somebody to government. they go and they vote on issues in Parliament, and maybe, if you're lucky, your country's got some issues tracker. You can kind of see, how did this person vote on X, Y, and Z. But you got to trust that this person's going to do it this way, and the accountability loop is incredibly hard. So you see politicians campaign one way and rule the other way. Decentralization distributes the power across the network. And so there's many things that you could decentralize. First, foremost, who just access to the network. Blockchains like Ethereum and Bitcoin, anyone can access, right? So just the very point of decentralization of access is completely decentralized. But then if you want to update the code to the network, you need to have a certain number of people within the ecosystem agreeing to it.
Okay.
And if you want to change different protocols, so it allows for, I think there's an opportunity to scale. Like, cooperatives is a for-profit business generally, and yet they tend to not be a preferred business model because they're quite inefficient in being able to get things done and move quickly, is the feedback that you hear in some cases. And technology, like decentralized technologies, kind of unlock that ability to be more efficient while maintaining your values of having a more spread out ecosystem. And, I would say, look at a credit union. It's kind of the concept of the membership, et cetera, is quite decentralized, but their reliance on centralized infrastructure, they're using what centralized banks are using in order to try to accomplish their business. And yet it's not actually fully in line with their mandate and values as a member-owned and operated organization.
Fascinating. I think that really clears things up. I also feel as though the power, the promise of decentralization in terms of trust, and I might be misunderstanding this, so you have to tell me if I'm wrong here, but is there an element of relinquishing trust in a central figure and depending upon the community to take care of one another that is inherently more transparent and trustworthy than otherwise? Because if that's the case, it seems like a heck of an indictment of the colonial powers that tend to want one single locus of control over everything, right?
Well, like everything, it's centralization and decentralization is on a spectrum. How you federate that is really, that will kind of define how that network functions if we're talking about digital technologies. So you see everything, very decentralized to, blockchain being used, but centralizing control, to centralized databases and technologies that are focused on, gathering stakeholder input and boiling that up into a decision-making framework for somebody whose job is to execute that mandate, right? So the tools can be used on either side to accomplish, some of these objectives, but some are more fit for purpose. You don't throw a hammer at everything, and so I think that's kind of what we've seen with these new technologies that are coming through: edge computing, zero knowledge proofs, blockchain. Is infrastructure that allows for much higher degrees of accountability. A centralized system, you can always go and do something and, borrow from the book 1984, then you can go and rewrite the double good speak, And with decentralized system, if they're properly decentralized, you can still go off the rails and scam somebody with your, blockchain token offering or what have you. But just remember that for the rest of time that humans will have computers and internet, it's all documented and anyone's able to look back, and there's no ability to rewrite it if it's properly decentralized. So I think there's a huge, I always found with what we deal with a lot in the tokenization within financial services of different types of assets, and using a blockchain quote unquote token as a certificate of ownership or rights, etc. And I have found it fascinating that some of the earliest players in the space were using it to scam people and using it to commit fraud and different things like this. And when the technology in and of itself is all about transparency and accountability, right? So it's very fascinating to see. But then again, the internet wasn't built on Zoom calls. There's always some people that run with I use the example in for example, Zoom or video calls or webinars, etc. None of this technology would have been available if it hadn't been for the online porn and online gaming industries working the kinks out of this technology. So, it's all these technologies get adopted somewhere and frankly exploited somewhere in a new way. We're seeing this with generative AI right now, where phishing attacks can be done at scale. And it's going to take us time to evolve and adapt around that.
It's amazing, the human condition, right? In terms of for what it can and choose to do. And you said earlier that the devil is in the detail, and like, man, I feel like the devil is writing the details half the time, right? So I want to ask you a question, and I want you. The context is 20 years from now, Matthew. You have patents and innovations in digital identity and financial systems, I believe. I mean, you are literally building the infrastructure of our digital future. And in the context of Indigenous people, we often think in terms of 7 generations. And so, how are you balancing these opportunities, these choices, with a longer term responsibilities to ensure that, or not to ensure. I don't want to put on any unnecessary load or kind of guilt on this stuff, but like the long term responsibility to serve Indigenous, your Indigenous communities and families and your son. What does success look like? I mean, if you could point, if a young Indigenous person 20 years from now could point to your work and say, this is how we maintained our sovereignty while engaging with the digital world on our own terms. I'd ask you to reflect on that.
Yeah, and the 7 generation philosophy for me is really powerful. I think it was even before learning it. I think it was a big part of I was very blessed to grow up with grandparents on both sides that loved and invested in me.
Nice.
And so much of what I do, I remember when I was one of my last grandparents before they passed away, I came home for a visit and, what are you doing now? And I was traveling and I was working on this really exciting project. And he asked me a bunch of questions, and he just shook his head and he's like, wow, there's only 2 generations, and and we went from here to here. Yeah. And, at the same time, like how I act and conduct myself, my ancestors are there, and now even when my stepfather passed away, we had a good relationship, and looking back and seeing how am I the legacy that they left me is something that I want to pass forward, and that's legacy of fatherhood and a legacy of working and applying yourself to something, whether it's farming or driving a truck or welding or whatever it is. But, I think there's that aspect of just finding something and just, that you're passionate about and pursuing it. But also not just pursuing it for your own personal gain or interest, but looking at what are you unlocking for, maybe it's your family or your community or what have you, and looking forward and into the future, specifically around these types of technologies. Let's rewind the clock 10 years ago. Let's go 15 years ago, like pre blockchain tokens and stuff really being in anyone's lexicon, right? 20 years ago, before Bitcoin paper came out. If you wanted to launch, if a First Nations wanted to launch their own currency, they have the sovereignty, they have self-governance, and they want to launch their own currency, it would be billions of dollars. Yeah. A central bank currency is very expensive to own and maintain, etc. The cost of doing so today, with the technology that we developed, which is now known as security token technology, is less than $10. You can go copy a Reddit thread. Anyone who can, who's done a weekend boot camp of coding can deploy a blockchain token. Now that unlocks all, great power comes great responsibility, but
Yes, yes.
I think that's a big part of it when that's related to financial transactions. When we look at identity itself, I think that the technology isn't ready yet entirely. Some of the verified credentials and DIDs, they all have the same Achilles heel, and there's still more work that needs to kind of be done
Right.
In that space. But what I see as the power and potential is even just looking at like being able to track your lineage or heritage as just one thing, being able to give somebody the right to be part of your nation or your community, and having that as your choice, not necessarily an Indian agent's decision whether or not they're going to allow that person to qualify to be part of your community or not. I think there's a lot of there's been a lot of judicial and political changes around Indigenous rights in Canada in the recent years. And there's a lack of infrastructure and capacity to actually kind of leapfrog, and put that stuff into practice. Okay, the rights are there for self-governance. Are we going to go and roll out, gov.ca 1.0 copied and just replicate it all, or is there actually a better mousetrap that can be applied? And there are hundreds of nations to test, and people are going to do it differently, and we're going to learn from that.
Yeah, amazing.
So it's very exciting.
Amazing. I really appreciate that answer. Thank you. So that's something. What's the advice you would give to a 20-year-old you for the future? Not only in terms of how you conduct yourself today, but what are the opportunities and where would you go in this kind of emergent? I hate to use that term emergent, but I guess it's always changing and evolving. So I guess we're in this kind of tidal wave of stuff. But I guess that would be my kind of wrap up question. Is that?
Man, that's a tough question for me, because I feel like there's like two sides to it. On one hand, you got to start with the why. And I think of that when I started my initial career working in finance. I thought I was going to be entering an industry and doing something very different than my day-to-day actually turned out to be. And I was I started to see success and was very dissatisfied with what was going on. However, it took me literally sitting down and asking why do I want to earn more money? Okay, well, what would I do if I had more money? And when I kept asking and literally digging deeper and deeper, I realized that what I was wanting to do and, create in the world and help people with and accomplish, money wasn't actually the barrier. And it was how and where I applied myself. Now, the double-edged sword to that being the very space that I was in and working and started to feel dissatisfied in my career in, I learned so much, and I would not be able to be here today if I hadn't gone in and soaked up and learned and saw how things were done the old way and understood those systems to be able to come up with a better a solution to those problems that those systems were creating. So, on one side, I think it's very important to be purpose driven, but also, just to take each experience as learning, and you never know when what you learn is going to be valuable.
No kidding.
And so just soak everything up and be inquisitive and keep exploring.
On behalf of both Lawrence and I wanted to say thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being a generous and wise guest on One Feather, Two Pens.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and definitely excited to check out some of the other episodes, but also also a big fan of what you guys are doing at One Feather as well.